Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know how this works. We take complex, fascinating stuff and boil it down so you don't have to. Today, we're going to be grappling with a pretty huge question.
That's right. You provided us with some excerpts from Stephen H. Phillips' work on K.G. Nishitani, specifically his analysis of Nishitani's Buddhist response to nihilism.
Right.
So our mission today is to understand Nishitani, a major figure in the Kyoto School of Philosophy, and his arguments about why modern life can feel so devoid of meaning, of ultimate meaning.
Exactly.
We'll be exploring his fascinating dialogue with Western thinkers, and crucially, how the Buddhist concept of śūnyatā, often translated as emptiness, might offer a way through all this.
It's really a space where East meets West in a powerful way.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember that Nishitani wasn't just an armchair philosopher.
Right.
I mean, he was deeply steeped in Mahayana Buddhism and Zen meditation specifically, Zazen, which we've talked about before, involving seated meditation and cultivating present moment awareness. But he actually made a conscious effort to use Western philosophical tools influenced by his teachers, Nishida and Heidegger, to explain and defend what he called the Zen experience. So in a sense, he was building bridges between these different worlds, which makes his work, I think, really relevant for us today.
I feel it.
Okay, so let's dive in. What was the central problem that Nishitani saw with modern philosophy, according to Phillips?
Well, in Nishitani's view, modern philosophy fundamentally fails to grapple with nihilism in any adequate way.
Okay.
That deep feeling that nothing ultimately matters, especially when you consider things like death and the seemingly cold, objective view of the universe that science presents.
Right, that unsettling sense that maybe our lives, bookended as they are by birth and death, are just these tiny, insignificant blips in a vast, uncaring cosmos.
Exactly. He felt that for any serious thinker, this had to be a real and pressing issue.
And from this, Phillips explains, Nishitani identifies a specific state that he calls nihility. So what's the key difference between just nihilism, the idea, and this active state of nihility? For Nishitani, nihility isn't just intellectually accepting that there's no meaning.
Okay.
It's the actual despair, that kind of active unease and anguish that comes from that realization. Think of it as the emotional and existential fallout, the lived experience of nihilistic thought.
It's not just a head thing. It's in your gut.
Exactly. And what's so interesting here is that Nishitani doesn't actually see this as entirely negative. He considers it a necessary stage, almost like a spiritual trial by fire.
Okay.
So the key takeaway here is that for him, facing this despair is a crucial step in moving beyond it.
Almost like hitting rock bottom before you can find a new foundation to build on.
Exactly.
Now, Phillips also discusses Nishitani's engagement with existentialists like Nietzsche and Sartre, who, of course, also recognized this lack of inherent meaning.
Yes.
They urged individuals to create their own meaning in the face of this void. Where did Nishitani find common ground with them, and where did he part ways? Nishitani agreed with Nietzsche and Sartre that there is no preordained meaning, and that individual engagement is essential. He actually admired their courage in confronting this void.
Right.
However, he felt that their solutions were ultimately incomplete.
Okay.
They emphasized individual will, this freedom to create meaning. But Nishitani argued that this creation can't happen in isolation.
Okay.
He believed it required a much deeper level of subjectivity, cultivated through Zazen, that seated meditation practice we mentioned.
Right.
So his key point here is that simply deciding to create meaning within the confines of your ordinary ego just isn't enough. You need a fundamental shift in perspective, achieved through this kind of rigorous meditative practice.
So it's not just a conscious, willful decision. It's about fundamentally changing how you perceive reality.
Exactly.
Okay, so Nishitani identifies nihilism as the problem, nihility as this crucial stage, however painful.
Yes.
Now let's delve into his critique of Western thought, particularly religion. Phillips points out that he had a surprising sympathy for certain Christian ideas alongside his criticisms.
Right.
That's an interesting tension.
And it is. He doesn't just dismiss religion outright. In fact, he deeply engages with Christian theology and actually finds certain aspects quite compelling.
Really?
Phillips even mentions that Nishitani uses Christian terms to describe Zen enlightenment.
Wow.
So there's this effort to find common ground,
Interesting.
resonances across these seemingly very different traditions.
But the criticisms are significant as well, especially his critique of the traditional Christian concept of God.
Absolutely. He raises two main objections. First, he critiques this idea of a purely transcendent God, who created the world ex nihilo, like out of nothing.
Right.
He argues that this creates too vast a gulf, ontologically speaking, between God and humanity, and that hinders any genuine religious experience, any possibility of real conversion.
Okay.
He felt it didn't provide a proper field, as he called it, for that connection to happen. Now, interestingly, he made an exception for certain Christian mystics, like Meister Eckhart, who he saw as having, in effect, bridged that gap through their own experiences.
Okay.
But the core issue here is that a God perceived as completely separate, completely out there, just doesn't align with Nishitani's understanding of what a real religious connection should be.
So a God who is completely other doesn't work for him. What was his second major objection?
His second point is a bit more familiar. It's the problem of evil,
Right.
the problem of evil and suffering, and also the seeming impersonal nature of the universe that we see through science.
Right.
So he argues that this traditional notion of an all-powerful, all-benevolent God just really struggles to adequately account for the suffering, the cruelty, the random, events that we see,
Right.
as well as the apparent indifference of natural laws. He saw this as a failure of Christian axiology. That's its theory of values, like fundamental principles it uses to determine what is good or bad, right and wrong. He felt like this system of values couldn't stand up to the realities of the world as we experience them.
And this failure, in Nishitani's view, contributed to the rise of nihilism, to this crisis of values that we see in modern society.
Exactly.
Now, Phillips also mentions that Nishitani thought Nietzsche and Sartre, while they correctly identified these issues with Christian axiology,
Yeah.
they didn't really offer a genuine alternative themselves.
Right.
They diagnosed the problem but didn't quite have the solution. So why not? Why did Nishitani think they fell short?
He gave them credit for recognizing those weaknesses in the traditional Christian views on values. But he felt they stopped short of offering a real solution, a way to truly overcome nihility.
Okay.
And this is where he introduces this central Buddhist concept, śūnyatā, or emptiness.
Okay, śūnyatā. This is really the heart of Nishitani's response.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about it. How does he position śūnyatā as the antidote to this pervasive sense of meaninglessness?
So śūnyatā, in Nishitani's framework, is not just nothingness in a negative sense.
Okay.
It's actually presented as a kind of fundamental reality, something that can fundamentally transcend nihility.
Okay.
And it offers a way to navigate what he saw as a false choice.
Okay.
So the false choice being either abandoning the search for meaning altogether
Right.
or seeking it in something completely separate from ourselves, which is what he criticizes in Judeo-Christian thought.
Okay.
So the core insight here is that śūnyatā offers a third way beyond these two, he felt, unsatisfactory options.
So a middle path that avoids both despair and this reliance on an external, maybe even unattainable source of meaning.
Precisely. And while having the right view, the intellectual understanding of śūnyatā is important.
Right.
Nishitani really stresses that you need this existential appropriation.
Right.
It's not enough to just understand it as a concept. You need to actually deeply realize it and integrate it into your being.
You have to live it.
Yes, exactly. And he argues that it's only on this field of śūnyatā that we can truly find refuge from that horror of nihility, both existentially in our lived experience and theoretically on that intellectual level.
Okay.
So śūnyatā needs to be more than just an idea. It needs to be a lived reality.
Okay, so śūnyatā is this transformative reality. Now, let's revisit those critiques of Sartre and Nietzsche, specifically in light of this concept.
Okay.
Starting with Sartre, Phillips says that Nishitani felt that Sartre was blind to a greater transcendence of nihility. What did he mean by that?
Nishitani felt that Sartre's focus on the individual will and consciousness, within our kind of ordinary self-awareness, was limited.
Okay.
He argued that while Sartre emphasized freedom and creation of meaning through action, he kind of remained trapped within the confines of the ego. And Nishitani believed that this small, isolated ego just isn't capable of creating meaning that can truly stand up against this backdrop of ultimate meaninglessness.
Yeah.
It needs to be grounded in something larger, something that transcends the ego. And for Nishitani, that's śūnyatā.
Okay.
And he actually saw Sartre's nothingness, which
Yeah.
Sartre talked about, this nothingness immanent to the ego, as fundamentally different from the Buddhist concept of non-ego.
Interesting.
He argued that Sartre's view ultimately traps the ego within itself.
Okay.
So the big difference is that Sartre's freedom, in Nishitani's eyes, is still bound by the limitations of that individual self.
So even Sarkar's radical freedom is still too small, too contained within that limited sense of self to truly address this profound despair of nihility.
Right.
Okay, now what about Nietzsche? Phillips suggests that Nishitani engaged with him more on metaphysical grounds?
Yes, that's right. Nishitani saw Nietzsche as having this deeper awareness of an enlarged self-experience through his own intense confrontation with nihilism. He even saw Nietzsche's path of despair and doubt as leading to a kind of Zen-like expansion of self-understanding, which is really interesting.
Well, yeah.
However, he took issue with Nietzsche's concept of the impersonal will to power.
Okay.
So he argued that the will to power, this kind of driving force, doesn't adequately account for some really key aspects of our lived experience.
Like what?
Like the immediate actuality of the present moment and the two-directional infinity of time. He felt that this idea of a driving impersonal force just didn't capture that richness of our moment-to-moment existence.
Right, and this ties into that Buddhist aversion to substance concepts, as Phillips mentioned.
Yes.
The idea of a fixed underlying will to power probably felt too concrete, too reified for Nishitani's Buddhist perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And Nishitani actually offers what he calls a transcendental argument,
Okay.
suggesting that only śūnyatā can truly explain those fundamental aspects of our everyday awareness. And he felt that Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, the idea that everything will just repeat infinitely,
Right, the eternal return.
that ultimately leads to a loss of our sense of self and limits the genuine openness, the possibilities of the future. So he saw śūnyatā, with its inherent openness and lack of this fixed substance, as providing a much better framework for understanding these phenomena.
So śūnyatā allows for genuine novelty in a future that's not predetermined.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's delve into the nature of śūnyatā itself. Phillips describes it as both a unitary world ground and this absolutely immanent self-positing ground.
Right.
Those sound kind of paradoxical.
It does sound paradoxical, but this apparent paradox is really central to how Nishitani understands it. Śūnyatā is not just this static void.
Okay.
It's actually this dynamic, interconnected field that sustains all finite forms.
Okay.
You could think of it like the canvas upon which all paintings appear,
Okay.
or the ocean from which all the waves arise. At the same time, it's also intimately connected to each individual self, a kind of no ground that becomes transparent in enlightenment. So it's both the foundation of all things and the potential for this radical self-understanding within each of us.
So it's not just out there, it's also in here, deeply within us.
Exactly.
Phillips then outlines 6 clusters of argument where Nishitani claims that śūnyatā provides this unique understanding.
Right.
Let's go through them one by one. The first one is the inside and outside of things, the classic mind-body problem. How does śūnyatā address that?
Nishitani suggests that śūnyatā, as this fundamental unity underlying both subject and object, is actually the very condition that makes it possible to distinguish between an inner subjective experience and an outer objective world in the first place.
Okay.
It's like saying that awareness itself precedes and makes possible the perception of inside and outside.
I see.
And Phillips notes that he doesn't go into extensive detail about this.
Okay.
But the core idea, which is maybe a little bit surprising, is that śūnyatā actually dissolves that seemingly inherent separation between mind and body by being the ground from which both arise.
So a unifying ground that precedes that split.
Exactly.
The second argument is the interconnectedness of a world of many things.
Right.
Now, this seems to relate more directly to that field idea.
Yes, exactly. Nishitani argues that śūnyatā, as this inherent unity, is what makes a world of interconnected things possible at all.
Okay.
He suggests that without this underlying unity, you'd only have fragmentation and chaos.
Right.
He uses this image of a vast network where every point is connected to every other point.
I see.
And he even frames this as a kind of Buddhist teleological argument, suggesting that śūnyatā is that necessary home ground for everything to exist in relation.
Okay.
And this leads to that interesting sub-theme of the master-slave phenomena.
The master-slave dynamic arising from this unity. That sounds interesting. Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, so Nishitani sees the self as inherently capable of being both master and slave in relation to others. He argues that the very act of asserting yourself as master implies a relationship of dependence and therefore the potential for also being a slave, this kind of reciprocity.
Okay.
And it arises from this fundamental unity of śūnyatā and this interdependence of all things. So our actions, our assertions of power, create ripples within this interconnected web. affecting not only others, but ourselves as well.
Right.
So the surprising takeaway here is that within this unity, dominance and submission are really two sides of the same coin.
It's like that saying, what goes around comes around.
Exactly.
The third argument is about the freedom of the self, including the ability to renounce freedom for others. Now, how does that work?
So Nishitani emphasizes that we do have this potential for self-determination.
Right.
Our ability to make choices and even see the world around us as, objects to be acted upon.
Right.
But this freedom, he says, is always intertwined with this principle of world interdependence. We face limitations, and we're inevitably in service to others in various ways. But on this deeper level, Nishitani connects the appropriation of śūnyatā, remember that lived experience, with a radical form of freedom. The freedom to become the slave of all.
Okay.
And he uses the example of Jesus's kenosis, or self-emptying, to illustrate this.
I see.
He sees this selfless service, born from a realization of our interconnectedness in śūnyatā, as the path to actually realizing our true self.
That's a powerful idea that real freedom is found in selflessness.
Exactly.
Okay, the fourth argument is about the unique individuality of a multiplicity of things within this interconnectedness. So how do we account for both unity and distinctness?
Nishitani argues that only on the field of śūnyatā, where the being of all things is fundamentally one with emptiness, can each thing retain its absolute uniqueness while still being deeply interconnected.
Okay.
He speaks of this system of circumsessional being, where each individual entity, in its very being, reflects and contains the entire web of interpenetration.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. It's like each part contains the whole in some way. It makes me think of those holograms where you can break off a piece and it still contains the whole image.
Yes, exactly. That's a good analogy. But as Phillips points out, he doesn't fully explain why things have the specific characteristics they do.
Okay.
Only this general phenomenon of unique particularity arising within this unified field.
So he provides the framework for individuality, but not necessarily the specifics of individual forms.
That's right.
Okay, the fifth argument involves the two-directional infinity of time and the openness of the future.
Right.
And this connects back to that critique of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence.
Exactly. So Nishitani highlights that the Sanskrit term shunya also means nothing or zero.
Right.
Which he conceives of as this boundless infinite,
Okay.
a zero of all finite determinations. And this infinite openness, he argues, is what makes that two-directional infinity of time possible.
Okay.
The past stretching infinitely behind us, and the future remaining genuinely open, undetermined, unlike that cyclical and predetermined view of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence.
So it's not just a circle, it's a line that keeps going in both directions, with genuine possibility for the future.
Precisely. Śūnyatā, lacking that fixed endpoint or any inherent limitations, allows for genuine novelty and the openness of history.
A boundless potentiality at the heart of time itself. Okay, and finally, the sixth argument is about the human reality of nihility itself.
Yes.
So how does śūnyatā explain our very experience of this meaninglessness?
Nishitani argues that no philosophy of being, with its focus on fixed substances, inherent essences,
Right.
that no philosophy of being can actually account for the transcendence that's reflected in our experience of nihility. He sees śūnyatā with its inherent element of negativity, in the sense of being empty of inherent existence,
Okay.
and its transcendent nature as the very ground from which our awareness of meaninglessness arises.
Okay.
So our small ego-driven goals, they're revealed as ultimately transient and empty when we face death and impermanence.
Right.
And śūnyatā provides this framework for understanding the inherent kind of precariousness of our finite existence, and why these purely being-oriented philosophies just aren't able to address that.
So nihility isn't just a psychological quirk, it's a reflection of a deeper truth about reality itself.
Exactly.
Now, Phillips raises this really interesting question about the logic and cosmology of śūnyatā.
Okay.
He points out that its explanatory power seems to come from both its transcendence and these divine features. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So Nishitani argues that the very transcendence of śūnyatā is precisely what allows for its immanence in all things.
Okay.
And guarantees their unique particularity.
Okay.
And he actually draws parallels with Hegel's concept of a genuine infinite.
Right.
And Nozick's, a more contemporary philosopher, mathematical analogy of like in infinite sets, to illustrate this idea of a unity that encompasses multiplicity.
Okay.
Without being reduced to a single static entity.
Right.
And he even explicitly calls śūnyatā a true infinity.
A true infinity.
Yeah, so the core idea here is that it's not just an absence, but this positively infinite ground of being.
Okay.
And this idea of a true infinity helps explain why he often uses these seemingly paradoxical statements when he talks about śūnyatā.
Right, because the usual logic doesn't quite apply.
Exactly.
He's talking about something that's beyond our typical ways of thinking.
Yeah, he believes that the logic we use for understanding finite things just doesn't map onto the infinite nature of śūnyatā.
Okay.
So those apparent paradoxes are meant to signal that we need to stretch our minds a bit, go beyond our usual conceptual frameworks to really grasp its true nature. He sees śūnyatā as negatively defined in the sense that it's not any particular finite thing.
Right.
But this emptiness is precisely what allows it to be the ground, the potentiality for all finite things to arise.
I see.
And he also attributes positive features to it,
Okay.
describing it as this unitary field, and also as a force, which he calls the dharan in Sanskrit. That sustains both subjectivity and finite forms, kind of moving from this formless center.
So it's both empty and full of creative potential.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the role of enlightenment in Nishitani's thought.
Okay.
And this problem of avidya, or ignorance, that Phillips brings up.
Right.
He points out this apparent conflict. What is it?
So the life affirmation of śūnyatā, according to Nishitani, is deeply connected to the attitudes and actions of an enlightened Zen master.
Okay.
And those are characterized by, playfulness, samadhi,
Yeah.
that state of deep meditative absorption, often translated as just sitting,
Right.
and this complete absence of self-regard.
Okay.
He implicitly suggests that this enlightened state, grounded in the direct experience of śūnyatā, is the true refuge from nihility.
Okay.
But the question arises, if śūnyatā is the underlying reality, why aren't we all already enlightened? Why are we still suffering?
Right. If it's our true nature, shouldn't it be shining through already?
Exactly. So this is where the concept of avidya, or beginningless ignorance, comes in as his explanation.
Okay.
It's the reason for this apparent discrepancy between what is and what we experience.
Okay, so avidya is the explanation for this gap between the reality of śūnyatā and our current unenlightened suffering state.
Yeah.
What exactly is it?
Nishitani describes it as this fundamental self-enclosure, this beginningless ignorance that fuels karmic activity and prevents us from recognizing our inherent connection to śūnyatā.
Okay.
It's presented as a kind of brute fact,
Okay.
like a fundamental condition of our existence as rational beings, caught in our own limited perspectives, clinging to this false sense of self and inherent existence.
So it's not something we choose. It's this deep-seated misperception that clouds our true nature.
Right.
Now, Phillips critiques this explanation, calling it a theoretical weakness. Why?
He argues that by just presenting avidya as this beginningless fact, unexplained, Nishitani doesn't really resolve the tension between this glorious potential of śūnyatā and the very real suffering and ignorance that we see all around us.
Right.
Like if śūnyatā is this grand, life-affirming reality, why does this obscuring ignorance arise in the first place?
Yeah, where did it come from?
Exactly.
Right.
It leaves that question kind of unanswered within the system. And it weakens the claim that śūnyatā provides a completely satisfying solution to nihility.
It's like having this perfect system with an unexplained flaw at its core.
Right.
Okay, lastly, Phillips talks about mysticism and the resilience of Nishitani's thought. He suggests that maybe the real strength lies in its mystical motivation.
Yes, he argues that Nishitani's philosophy is really deeply rooted in that Zen experience.
Okay.
This direct, transformative encounter that he believes reveals this deeper non-dual reality.
Okay.
And he actually draws a parallel here with Aurobindo,
Oh, interesting.
another modern mystic who saw his own mystical experiences as revelatory, like the foundation for his whole thought system. And Phillips suggests that this argument from mystical experience is central to these kinds of spiritualist views like Nishitani's.
Okay.
It provides a kind of fundamental conviction that goes beyond these purely intellectual arguments.
You can't argue someone out of an experience.
Exactly.
It's like, trying to convince someone who's tasted chocolate that it's not actually delicious.
Right, exactly.
They know because they've had that experience.
Exactly. And he points out that Nishitani's critique of Sartre, for example, ultimately relies on the authority of this experienced state of transcendence.
Okay.
So it's not just about the logic. It's about this connection to this powerful personal experience.
So it's not just a philosophy, it's intertwined with this lived, transformative experience that gives it its power.
Yeah.
And Phillips suggests that this tension we see in Nishitani's thought between the value of śūnyatā and the reality of suffering might come from this profound appreciation for this mystical experience. That he's trying to point towards the state of surpassing value that can't be fully captured by these intellectual concepts alone.
Right.
He's trying to use words to point to something that's ultimately beyond words.
Exactly.
So even if his attempts to fully explain this relationship between that mystical experience and ordinary reality aren't totally airtight, you could see his work as this powerful invitation to explore this inner mystical dimension as a potential pathway beyond the limitations of our normal understanding and this deep despair of nihility.
Absolutely.
So, to sum up our deep dive into Nishitani, he identifies nihilism as the central problem of modern thought.
Yes.
He critiques both Western religious and philosophical attempts to overcome it.
Right.
And he proposes śūnyatā, this emptiness, realized through practices like Zazen, as the true way to transcend this feeling of meaninglessness.
Exactly. And it's really this fascinating blend of Eastern Buddhist thought and Western philosophical concepts, which is really what the Kyoto School is all about.
Absolutely. And while Nishitani's framework does raise these complex questions, particularly about the nature of avidya, where it comes from, and exactly how śūnyatā affirms life in the face of nihility, it offers this really unique and compelling perspective that emphasizes the importance of inner experience and the possibility of a reality that goes beyond our everyday understanding.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to our final thought for you.
Okay.
So, consider that immense value that Nishitani places on this Zen experience and this radical idea of a reality that transcends our ordinary intellectual grasp. Does this suggest a genuine pathway to meaning that Western thought, with its emphasis on reason and objective truth, might have missed? What aspects of this exploration of nihilism and emptiness resonate with you? Maybe it's worth taking some time to reflect on Nishitani's challenging ideas, or even exploring those practices of Zen Buddhism for yourself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some new ways of thinking about meaning and existence.
Until our next exploration on the deep dive.